The good news is that Louis XIV was the most powerful monarch in Europe, living in the most spectacular palace ever built, surrounded by fountains, gold, and mirrors that reflected his magnificent glory. The bad news is that beneath all that silk, velvet, and powdered wig, the Sun King smelled like a dumpster behind a fish market in August, and so did everyone else at Versailles. We're talking about a man who ruled France for 72 years, but couldn't be bothered to take more than 3 baths in his entire lifetime. Yes, you read that right. 3 baths total, and he lived to be 77 years old. That's roughly 1 bath every quarter century, which means he went longer between washes than most people go between dental checkups. The irony here is delicious. The king who built the most extravagant palace in human history, complete with elaborate water features and hundreds of fountains, was basically allergic to using water on his own body. Now, before you start thinking this was just Louis being eccentric, let me clarify that this wasn't a personal quirk. This was the medical advice of the time. 17th century doctors genuinely believed that bathing was dangerous, that water opened your pores and let disease waltz right into your body like an unwanted party guest. They thought infections entered through your skin when it was wet, so the wealthy elite took this advice seriously and avoided water like it was liquid plague. The peasants, ironically, bathed more frequently than the aristocracy, which is the kind of backwards logic that makes you wonder how humanity survived this long. While poor people were jumping into rivers and streams, the rich were rubbing themselves down with linen cloths and calling it hygiene. Louis XIV himself had his servants wipe him down with cloths soaked in alcohol or spirits, which basically means he smelled like a drunk who'd been marinating in cologne. The Sun King's daily routine involved getting rubbed down by attendants who would scrub his body with dry or barely damp cloths, a process that was considered the height of cleanliness for the era. This wasn't just a quick once-over either. It was an elaborate ceremony that took place in front of dozens of courtiers who fought for the privilege of watching the king get his sponge bath. Yes, you heard that correctly. Noblemen literally competed for the honor of watching another man get wiped down like a dirty countertop. There were formal positions at court dedicated to different aspects of the king's personal hygiene, or lack thereof, and these positions were highly coveted because they gave you access to the monarch. The guy who held the king's shirt was more important than most government ministers, which tells you everything about how this society had its priorities completely backwards. But here's where it gets really interesting. Louis XIV had a terror of water that went beyond medical advice into the realm of full-blown phobia. After he allegedly bathed in 1665 and got sick shortly afterward, he basically swore off bathing forever, convinced that water was trying to murder him. For the remaining 50-plus years of his life, he stuck to his cloth rub-downs and occasionally washing his hands and face, occasionally being the key word here. His courtiers noted that he rarely washed his hands even before meals, which means the man who touched everything from state documents to food was basically spreading his personal ecosystem across all of France. Imagine shaking hands with someone who hadn't properly washed in months, let alone decades, and that person controls your entire future, can throw you in prison, or give you land and titles. That's the power dynamic we're dealing with here. The king's aversion to bathing wasn't just about his body. He had a legendary case of terrible breath that courtiers mentioned in their diaries, though obviously never to his face unless they had a death wish. Louis had awful teeth, most of which had rotted away or been extracted by the royal tooth puller, leaving him with chronic dental infections and breath that could wilt flowers at 20 paces. One courtier wrote that you could tell when the king was approaching a room by the smell that preceded him, which is perhaps the most diplomatic way of saying someone stinks that I've ever encountered. The really wild part is that losing most of his teeth created a hole between his mouth and nasal cavity, which meant food and drink would sometimes come out of his nose when he ate. Yes, the most powerful man in Europe was basically a human fountain, but not the decorative kind he spent millions building in his gardens. Despite all this, or perhaps because of it, Louis XIV became obsessed with perfume, and under his reign, France became the perfume capital of the world, a position it still holds today. The king would douse himself in fragrances, change scents multiple times a day, and insisted that his apartments be sprayed with perfume constantly to mask the various bodily odors wafting around Versailles. He even had special servants whose only job was to walk around spraying perfume, like human air fresheners at the world's fanciest truck stop bathroom. The French perfume industry basically owes its existence to the fact that nobody wanted to smell each other's natural funk, which is an origin story they don't put in the glossy advertisements. Grasse, the perfume capital of France, grew wealthy, supplying the court with enough fragrance to cover up what was essentially a palace-sized hygiene disaster. The really mind-blowing thing is that Louis XIV set fashion trends that all of Europe copied, which means his aversion to bathing became fashionable across the continent. If the Sun King didn't bathe, then bathing must be vulgar and lower class, right? This is how one man's phobia became an entire continent's health crisis for generations. British and German aristocrats started avoiding baths too, reasoning that if it was good enough for the greatest king in Europe, it was good enough for them. The result was that European nobility basically marinated in their own filth for decades, while congratulating themselves on their superiority and refinement. It's the kind of monkey-see-monkey-do mentality that led to an entire social class smelling like a Renaissance fair porta-potty during peak summer operation. Now, you might be thinking, surely someone said something, right? Wrong. At Versailles, pointing out that the king or anyone else smelled was the equivalent of social suicide. You'd be laughed out of court and probably never receive another invitation or patronage for the rest of your miserable life. Instead, everyone pretended that the eye-watering stench was completely normal, because that's what you do when your entire livelihood depends on royal favor and the king happens to smell like a dead raccoon wrapped in expensive silk. Courtiers developed elaborate codes to talk about smell without actually mentioning it, referring to someone's presence or aura when they really meant, dear God, did something die in here? The elaborate etiquette of Versailles covered everything from how to bow to which fork to use, but somehow forgot to include, please don't smell like a mobile garbage fire. The king's bedroom, despite being one of the most ornate rooms ever created, was reportedly one of the smelliest places in the palace, which is saying something considering the competition. Louis slept in the same bed for decades without changing the mattress or bedding with any regularity, and his physicians noted that his sheets were rarely washed because, again, the medical theory that dirt protected you from disease. The royal bed became a kind of petri dish of historical proportions, fermenting the collected sweat, skin cells, and various bodily secretions of France's longest reigning monarch. When you consider that important state ceremonies, including the famous morning levee where courtiers watched the king wake up, took place in this aromatic chamber, you start to understand why perfume was such big business. Louis XIV's relationship with personal hygiene extended to his mistresses as well, though they reportedly had better grooming habits than he did. The king had numerous affairs throughout his life, and one has to wonder what it was like for these women to get intimate with a man whose dental situation resembled a dental student's horror exam and whose bathing schedule made a medieval peasant look fastidious. Yet, they couldn't refuse him. He was the king, after all, and royal favor meant wealth, status, and security for your entire family. It's perhaps the ultimate example of money can't buy happiness, but apparently it can make you overlook catastrophic personal hygiene. Some mistresses reportedly tried to encourage the king to wash more, but they had to do so carefully, framing it as a sensual experience rather than a desperate plea for basic cleanliness. The Sun King's attitude toward bodily functions was equally casual. He thought nothing of receiving ministers and making important decisions while sitting on his clothes stool, which was the fancy term for a portable toilet. Foreign ambassadors reported the deeply unsettling experience of discussing trade agreements or military alliances while the King of France relieved himself mere feet away, as if this was completely normal diplomatic protocol. Louis believed that every moment of his day was a potential stage for displaying royal power, including his bathroom breaks, which meant that some poor duke might have the privilege of watching the king take a dump while simultaneously being denied the trade concession he'd traveled 3 weeks to request. It's the kind of power move that makes modern office politics look positively civilized by comparison. The Palace of Versailles itself was designed as the ultimate statement of royal power and magnificence, with its hall of mirrors, elaborate gardens, and enough gold leaf to fund a small country's economy for a year. But here's the dirty secret that tour guides conveniently skip. There were virtually no bathrooms in this architectural marvel. For a palace that housed up to 10,000 people, including courtiers, servants, government officials, and various hangers-on, the facilities were criminally inadequate. There were maybe a dozen actual toilet rooms in the entire complex, which meant the ratio of people to toilets was roughly 1,000 to 1. Compare that to modern building codes that require one toilet per 50 people in commercial spaces, and you start to understand the mathematical nightmare of bladder management at Versailles. The result was predictable and absolutely disgusting. Since waiting for one of the few actual toilets could take hours, and nobody wanted to miss an important moment at court because they were standing in a bathroom line, people simply relieved themselves wherever they happened to be. The corners of hallways, behind curtains, in the stairwells, even in the famous gardens. Everything was fair game when nature called. The palace grounds were essentially one giant open-air toilet, and the smell during summer must have been absolutely apocalyptic. Imagine the world's most beautiful palace, covered in Renaissance art and Baroque splendor, where every marble corner smells like a urinal at a football stadium in the fourth quarter. The great terraces where nobles would promenade in their finest clothes were regularly hosed down to wash away the accumulated filth, but it was like trying to bail out the Titanic with a teaspoon. A hopeless task that never quite solved the underlying problem. Louis XIV himself contributed to this problem with enthusiasm, reportedly using the aforementioned clothes stool constantly throughout the day, and his servants had to empty it regularly and cart the contents through the palace. This wasn't done discreetly either. The removal of royal waste was just another part of the endless parade of servants moving through Versailles with various tasks. So you might be admiring a priceless painting when suddenly someone walks past you carrying a bucket of the king's excrement. It's the kind of multisensory experience that really brings history to life in ways you never wanted. The clothes stool itself was an elaborate piece of furniture, upholstered in velvet and decorated with the royal coat of arms, because apparently even your toilet needs to remind everyone who's in charge. Nothing says absolute monarchy quite like embroidering your butt rest with symbols of divine right. The courtiers who lived at Versailles developed various coping strategies for the bathroom situation, including chamber pots that were kept in their rooms and then emptied out windows at night. Yes, you read that correctly. People would literally throw their waste out of palace windows, creating a hazardous rain of human excrement that made walking near the building walls an adventure in dodging biological warfare. The palace gardens, for all their geometric perfection and carefully manicured hedges, were essentially a minefield of human waste, both fresh and decomposing. Garden workers had one of the worst jobs at Versailles, constantly cleaning up after nobles who treated the Sun King's masterpiece landscaping like the world's fanciest public restroom. The fountains, when they actually worked, helped mask some of the smell, which might explain why Louis was so obsessed with water features. If you can't beat the stench, drown it out with eau de cologne and fountain spray. The fashion of the era actually made the bathroom situation even more complicated, because the elaborate outfits worn by both men and women took forever to put on and take off. Women wore multiple layers, including chemises, corsets, panniers, petticoats, and finally the dress itself, all of which had to be removed or navigated when nature called. Men had it slightly easier but still wore multiple layers, tight breeches, stockings, and coats that required assistance to remove. The result was that people would literally hold it for hours rather than undergo the engineering challenge of disassembling their outfit, which explains why chamber pots were often kept nearby during social events. At fancy balls and parties, there would be designated rooms with multiple chamber pots where women could relieve themselves, usually with the help of servants who would assist with holding up the many layers of fabric. It was like a very unglamorous pit crew for your bladder. The king's own elaborate outfits took hours to put on each morning during the lever ceremony, where dozens of courtiers would watch him get dressed in a specific order that was choreographed like a bizarre fashion ballet. Each item of clothing, from his undergarments to his final coat, was handed to him by a different nobleman based on strict hierarchy and protocol. The guy who handed the king his right shoe might outrank the guy who handed him his left shoe, because that's apparently how you run a government efficiently. This meant that Louis literally couldn't get dressed without an audience and a carefully planned sequence of nobles participating in the process. Now imagine if, in the middle of this elaborate ceremony, the king needed to pee. The whole production would grind to a halt, or, more likely, he'd just hold it and suffer, because stopping the lever would throw off the entire court schedule. The glamour just keeps coming. One particularly disgusting aspect of court life was that people rarely changed their clothes with any regularity, and washing clothes was expensive and time-consuming, so outfits would be worn repeatedly until they were literally falling apart or too stained to be seen in public. The wealthy would mask the smell of unwashed clothes with more perfume, creating an aromatic cocktail of body odor, fabric decay, and whatever floral fragrance was fashionable that season. Louis XIV himself was noted for changing his shirts more frequently than most, sometimes multiple times per day, but even this was just swapping one piece of clothing while keeping everything else the same. His elaborate just-to-corpse coats, embroidered with gold thread and decorated with jewels, went months between cleanings because the decorations couldn't survive the washing process. So the Sun King would parade around in a coat worth more than most people earned in a lifetime, while that same coat smelled like it had been marinating in armpit sweat since the previous Christmas. The whole perfume situation at Versailles reached comical proportions, with courtiers competing to wear the strongest and most expensive scents, turning the palace into a chemical weapons facility of competing fragrances. Walking through the halls must have been like passing through different layers of olfactory hell. Here you get hit with rose water, 3 steps later it's orange blossom, then suddenly you're drowning in musk, followed by a wall of ambergris that makes your eyes water. People would apply perfume so liberally that it would drip off them like they'd just emerged from a swimming pool, and handkerchiefs were constantly soaked in fragrance and held to noses to block out both other people's perfume and their underlying natural funk. The really expensive perfumes contained ingredients like civet musk, extracted from the anal glands of civet cats, because nothing says luxury like cat but secretions, and ambergris, whale vomit, aged to perfection in the ocean. Yes, the aristocracy was essentially wearing whale vomit and cat anus perfume to cover up the fact that they hadn't bathed in months. That's the kind of irony that history serves up perfectly chilled. The medical establishment of the time wasn't just wrong about bathing. They were spectacularly, dangerously wrong about almost everything related to hygiene and health. Doctors believed that disease was caused by bad air or miasmas, so they focused on smells rather than actual cleanliness. If something smelled bad, you just covered it up with something that smelled good. Problem solved. This is why doctors treating plague patients would wear those famous bird beak masks stuffed with aromatic herbs and spices. They thought the good smells would protect them from the bad air causing disease, when really they needed to wash their damn hands. The same logic applied at Versailles. If the palace smelled like an open sewer, you just needed more perfume, not better sanitation. It's the medical equivalent of putting an air freshener in a car with a dead body in the trunk and thinking you've solved the problem. Louis XIV physicians had elaborate theories about the humors and bodily balance that led to treatments that were often worse than the diseases they were supposed to cure. The king was regularly purged, bled, and given enemas, sometimes multiple enemas in a single day, based on a medical theory that you needed to expel bad humors from your body. The royal behind saw more medical intervention than most modern patients see in a lifetime, with doctors administering laxatives, suppositories, and enemas with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for religious converts. Louis received over 2,000 enemas during his lifetime, which is roughly one every 12 days for 77 years. At some point, you have to wonder if the king's irritable disposition had less to do with the pressures of absolute monarchy and more to do with the fact that his doctors kept violating his posterior with the consistency of a part-time job. The king's diet didn't help matters either. He was famous for eating enormous quantities of food at every meal, often consuming enough at dinner to feed a small family for a week. Contemporary accounts describe him eating multiple soups, whole fowls, plates of game, salads, pastries, and fruits in a single sitting, washing it all down with wine diluted with water, one of the few times he voluntarily consumed H2O. This kind of eating, combined with zero exercise beyond walking in the gardens and those constant medical interventions, meant Louis had chronic digestive problems that made his clothes stool one of the most frequently used pieces of furniture in his possession. The man could conquer foreign territories, but couldn't conquer his own bowels, which is perhaps the great equalizer that proves even absolute monarchs are human. His courtiers had to pretend not to notice when the king was obviously uncomfortable or when his digestive distress made his presence even more aromatic than usual, maintaining the fiction that royalty somehow transcended normal bodily functions. The irony of Louis XIV's situation is that he lived in an age when his own palace was more technologically advanced than most of the world. Versailles had mechanical fountains, elaborate pulley systems for chandeliers, and innovative architectural features. Yet basic sanitation was worse than what ancient Romans had enjoyed 1,500 years earlier. The Romans had public baths, aqueducts, running water, and sewage systems that medieval and early modern Europe had completely forgotten about or abandoned. So here was the Sun King, living in the most advanced palace of his age, in a civilization that had somehow gone backwards in terms of basic hygiene compared to ancient times. It's like if our generation forgot how to make cars and started riding horses again, but convinced ourselves we were more advanced because our horses wore better hats. The social hierarchy at Versailles was so rigid and absurd that your proximity to the king's body, including his unwashed, malodorous body, was literally a measure of your importance and power in French society. The closer you could get to Louis XIV physically, the more influence you wielded, which meant ambitious nobles spent their entire lives scheming for the privilege of standing near a man who smelled like a cheese factory explosion. There were official positions like the Grand Chamberlain, who helped the king dress, and the captain of the guard, who stood near him constantly. And these weren't just ceremonial titles. They came with real political power, land grants, and financial benefits. The whole system was designed so that serving the king's body, in all its fragrant glory, was the pathway to wealth and status. It's feudalism meets performance art, meets a particularly elaborate hazing ritual. The morning lever ceremony, where the king woke up and got dressed, had over 100 specific steps and involved dozens of participants who entered the room in carefully prescribed order based on their rank. The first physician would enter first to check on the king's health, followed by the Grand Chamberlain, then various dukes and princes of the blood, each with their specific role in the ritual. Some nobles had the right to hand the king his shirt, others his breeches, still others would present his sword or his wig, and they would literally fight over these privileges because being part of the lever meant you had the king's ear during those precious morning moments. Imagine grown men, supposedly sophisticated aristocrats, getting into bitter feuds over who gets to hand another man his pants. The pettiness of it all would be hilarious if these same people didn't control the government, military, and economy of the most powerful nation in Europe. The lever wasn't just about getting dressed. It was political theater where deals were made, alliances formed, and enemies identified. If the king spoke to you during the lever, your status shot up. If he ignored you, everyone noticed and your stock felt like a bad investment. Louis XIV weaponized his own morning routine, using it to reward loyalty and punish disloyalty with nothing more than a glance or a word. He could destroy a man's career by simply not acknowledging his presence while putting on his stockings, which is perhaps the most passive-aggressive use of hosiery in human history. The courtiers watching this daily drama would analyze every gesture, every word, every interaction between the king and the participants, trying to read the tea leaves of royal favor. It was like the world's highest-stakes reality TV show, except instead of getting voted off the island, you'd lose your pension and your family's estate. The evening coucher ceremony was the reverse process, where the king got undressed for bed with similar pomp and attendance, meaning that Louis XIV literally couldn't perform basic functions like getting dressed or undressed without an audience of nobility watching his every move. privacy was essentially non-existent for the king. His life was a constant performance, which might explain some of his more theatrical tendencies. Even when he used his clothes stool, there were usually attendants present, because God forbid the king should take a dump in solitude like some kind of peasant. The man had more people watching him defecate than most modern YouTubers have subscribers. And yet, this lack of privacy was considered the height of privilege and sophistication, because the nobles who got to watch were the lucky ones. It's the kind of backwards logic that makes you wonder if everyone at Versailles was suffering from some kind of collective lead poisoning. Speaking of which, the cosmetics of the era were literally toxic, adding another layer of health hazards to the already considerable hygiene nightmare at court. Both men and women wore thick white makeup made from lead, which gave them the fashionably pale complexion that was associated with nobility, since peasants got tan from working outdoors. This lead-based makeup, called Venetian ceruse, would slowly poison wearers, causing hair loss, tooth decay, skin lesions, and eventually death if used long enough. But hey, at least you looked fashionable while your organs shut down. Women would also apply rouge made from cinnabar, which contains mercury, another delightful poison that was great for achieving rosy cheeks and terrible for, staying alive. The beauty routine at Versailles was essentially slow-motion suicide by cosmetics. But everyone kept doing it, because looking pale and interesting was worth more than trivial concerns like not poisoning yourself. Louis XIV himself wore makeup daily, including that lead-based foundation, rouge on his cheeks, and even lipstick on occasion, along with elaborate powdered wigs that covered his increasingly bald head. The king started losing his hair in his 30s, possibly due to all that toxic makeup, terrible diet, and the countless enemas his doctors subjected him to. The wigs became larger and more elaborate to compensate, eventually reaching absurd heights that required their own architecture to maintain. These massive wigs were hot, heavy, uncomfortable, and provided excellent housing for lice, fleas, and other parasites that thrived in the unwashed hair, both human and horsehair used in the wigs. Courtiers would scratch their wig heads with special long sticks called scratchers, because getting your hands up into those towering hairdos was physically impossible. Picture the most powerful people in France, dressed in silks and jewels, using sticks to scratch their lice-infested wigs while pretending this was the peak of civilization. The lice situation of Versailles deserves its own historical footnote because it was absolutely epidemic. Virtually everyone had them, from the king on down to the lowest servants. Body lice, head lice, pubic lice. The palace offered a full-service experience for parasites of all preferences. Because people rarely bathe and even more rarely wash their clothes thoroughly, lice had ideal conditions to thrive and multiply like they'd found paradise. Courtiers would casually pick lice off themselves during conversations, flicking them away like it was no big deal because it wasn't. Everyone had them, so there was no shame in it. It's the only truly egalitarian aspect of Versailles. Kings and commoners alike shared their living space with countless tiny, blood-sucking roommates. The scratching must have been constant, a background symphony to all the courtly intrigue and diplomatic negotiations. Fleas were equally abundant, hopping from person to person, carpet to carpet, bed to bed, creating a sort of plague vector network throughout the palace. Women wore elaborate flea traps, small decorative tubes filled with honey or blood that they'd attach to their clothing or keep in their pockets to attract fleas away from their bodies. Yes, the solution to having too many fleas wasn't to clean or bathe, but to carry around a little flea honeypot like some kind of parasitic decoy system. The logic was beautifully circular. We're too fancy to bathe, which causes fleas, so we'll invent decorative flea catchers, which we can make fancy enough to become status symbols themselves. Before you know it, there was probably some duchess showing off her diamond-encrusted flea trap, while actual fleas were having a feast on her ankles. The capacity of the aristocracy to make elaborate accessories for problems they created through their own poor hygiene choices is almost admirable in its absurdity. The bedbugs at Versailles were another persistent problem, infesting the countless beds throughout the palace and making sleep an itchy, miserable affair for everyone. Even the king's elaborate royal bed, with its expensive fabrics and gold embroidery, was home to bedbugs that would emerge at night to feast on the Sun King himself. There's something darkly poetic about the most powerful man in the world being unable to defeat the tiny insects that shared his mattress, despite all his armies, wealth, and absolute authority. Courtiers would complain in letters about the bedbug situation, but there was no real solution beyond occasionally burning sulfur in the rooms, which just added noxious fumes to the already impressive collection of terrible smells. The smoke would drive bedbugs away temporarily, but also drive away oxygen, so you had to choose between being bitten all night or being mildly asphyxiated. Versailles offered choices like that constantly. The food situation at court was another vector for disease and discomfort that nobody seemed particularly concerned about. The kitchens were located far from the main dining areas, sometimes requiring servants to walk for 15 minutes carrying food, which meant everything arrived lukewarm at best and cold at worst. Louis XIV preferred eating with his hands for most foods, as did most courtiers, which meant fingers that hadn't been properly washed in weeks were constantly touching shared dishes. The same fingers that had been scratching lice-infested wigs and wiping bottoms with inadequate paper were then plunged into communal serving bowls. The transmission of disease must have been spectacularly efficient, though nobody made the connection between dirty hands and illness because, again, they thought disease came from bad air, not bad hygiene. It's amazing the French aristocracy survived as long as they did, given that every meal was essentially a biological warfare exercise. The wine at least was safer than water, which was part of the reason everyone drank alcohol constantly throughout the day. Water from wells and fountains around Versailles was frequently contaminated with runoff from all the human waste being dumped everywhere, so drinking it was genuinely dangerous. Wine's alcohol content killed some bacteria and parasites, making it the healthier choice, which is how you ended up with a court where everyone from children to elderly nobles was at least slightly drunk most of the time. This probably helped everyone tolerate the smell, the parasites, and the general awfulness of daily life at the palace. Hard to complain about bedbugs when you're 3 glasses of Burgundy deep and the room is spinning anyway. Louis XIV himself drank wine at every meal, always cut with water despite the health risks, because apparently even the Sun King had limits to his alcohol consumption, though those limits were still higher than most modern recommendations would allow. The medical treatments available when people inevitably got sick from these conditions were, if anything, worse than the diseases themselves. Beyond the constant purging and bleeding mentioned earlier, doctors would prescribe things like powdered mummy, yes, actual ground-up Egyptian mummies, which wealthy patients would consume as medicine, because apparently grave robbery becomes pharmaceutical innovation if you do it to foreigners from long ago. They'd also use remedies involving mercury, arsenic, and antimony. Basically the periodic table's greatest hits of things that will kill you. When Louis XIV developed diabetes in his later years, his doctor's solution was more purging and bleeding, which obviously didn't help regulate blood sugar, but did make him weaker and more miserable. The king suffered from gout, dental abscesses, headaches, and digestive problems throughout his life, and the medical establishment responded by making everything worse with treatments that ranged from useless to actively harmful. It's a miracle he lived to 77, given what his doctors put him through. The sexual politics at Versailles added another fascinating layer to the hygiene catastrophe, because despite everyone smelling like a medieval plague pit, courtiers were constantly engaged in elaborate affairs, seductions, and romantic intrigues that would make modern soap operas look tame by comparison. Louis XIV himself had numerous official mistresses throughout his reign, and the logistics of royal infidelity in an era of no bathing raises questions that perhaps are better left unexamined, but we're going to examine them anyway. The king's mistresses were given official positions and apartments at Versailles, and everyone knew about them, including the queen, because discretion wasn't really a thing when your entire life was public performance. These women had to navigate the delicate balance of being sexually available to a man who probably smelled like aged Parmesan while maintaining their dignity and status at a court, where one wrong move could destroy your reputation forever. The most famous of Louis's mistresses was Madame de Montespan, who held the position for over a decade and bore the king's 7 children, all while his actual wife was still alive and living down the hall. Montespan was known for her wit, beauty, and ruthless ambition, but she was also famous for her elaborate hygiene rituals, which by Versailles standards meant she actually bathed occasionally and changed her clothes more than once a month. She would spend hours preparing herself with perfumes, cosmetics, and scented oils before meeting with the king, essentially creating a chemical barrier between herself and the royal stench. Other courtiers joked that you could track the king's movements through the palace by following the trail of perfume he left behind after visiting Montespan's chambers, which is both romantic and deeply disturbing. The idea that someone's post-coital aroma could serve as a tracking mechanism tells you everything about the olfactory nightmare that was daily life at court. Contraception in this era was essentially non-existent, unreliable, or dangerous, which meant that affairs regularly resulted in pregnancies that everyone had to pretend to ignore or attribute to husbands who knew perfectly well they weren't the father. Louis XIV acknowledged his illegitimate children and even legitimized several of them, giving them titles and positions at court, which created a parallel family structure that was awkward for everyone involved except apparently the king, who seemed to think this was perfectly normal. The queen, Marie-Therese, had to endure watching her husband's mistresses parade around wearing jewels he'd given them, raising children who looked suspiciously like him, all while maintaining the fiction that everything was fine and this was just how royal marriages worked. She died relatively young, possibly from the stress of living in an elaborate charade where everyone knew her husband was sleeping with half the court, but nobody could acknowledge it directly. It's the kind of emotional torture that makes modern relationship problems look simple by comparison. The spread of sexually transmitted diseases at Versailles was inevitable given the combination of frequent partner swapping, no concept of germ theory, and the complete absence of effective treatments. Syphilis was rampant among the aristocracy, and while doctors didn't understand what caused it, they knew it was somehow connected to sexual activity, which didn't stop anyone from engaging in said activity constantly. The treatment for syphilis was mercury. Yes, the same poison they put in makeup, applied topically or even consumed, which would cause excessive salivation, tooth loss, and organ damage, symptoms that often overlapped with the disease itself. There was a saying, "A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury," which acknowledged the permanent consequences of temporary pleasure. But people kept having unprotected sex with multiple partners anyway, because humans are remarkably consistent at ignoring warnings when aroused. Louis XIV himself likely had syphilis at some point, though the records are unclear and doctors of the time weren't great at diagnosis, probably because they were too busy administering those 2,000 enemas to notice other health issues. The childbirth mortality rate among aristocratic women was horrifying. Roughly 1 in 5 women died in childbirth or from related complications, which meant that romantic affairs weren't just socially dangerous, but potentially lethal. The royal doctors who attended births had no concept of sterilization, would examine women with unwashed hands after dissecting corpses, and their interventions often caused infections that killed mother, child, or both. Marie-Therese, the queen, had 6 children and only 1 survived to adulthood, which was actually typical for the era. Louis XIV mother, and of Austria, had 4 stillbirths before successfully producing an heir. The elaborate fertility rituals, prayers, and medical interventions couldn't overcome the simple fact that nobody washed their hands, medical instruments, or anything else that came into contact with mother and baby. It's a testament to human resilience that anyone survived childbirth at all, given that doctors were essentially introducing bacteria directly into open wounds while congratulating themselves on their medical expertise. The contraceptive methods that did exist were hilariously ineffective and often disgusting. Women would insert half a lemon into their vaginas as a cervical cap. The citric acid supposedly killed sperm, or use pessaries made from crocodile dung mixed with honey, or drink potions containing mercury and lead, because if it doesn't kill the fetus, it might kill you instead. Problem solved. Condoms existed, but were made from animal intestines or bladders, were expensive, unreliable, and considered unpleasant by most men, so they were rarely used except by those trying to avoid syphilis, which again didn't work very well given the disease's prevalence. The withdrawal method was popular, though obviously not foolproof, and abortion was illegal but widely practiced through herbal remedies that ranged from ineffective to deadly. Wealthy women had slightly better access to these options, but that's like saying having a better seat on the Titanic. You're still on a sinking ship, just with a nicer view of the disaster. The homosexual relationships at court were equally complicated by the hygiene situation, though they had the advantage of not resulting in inconvenient pregnancies at least. Louis XIV's brother, Philippe, Duke of Orleans, was famously and flamboyantly gay, maintaining a series of male favorites who wielded considerable influence at court through their access to the king's sibling. Philippe wore more makeup and jewelry than most women, dressed in elaborate feminine fashions, and made no secret of his preferences, which Louis tolerated because Philippe was family and had done his dynastic duty by marrying and producing heirs before resuming his preferred lifestyle. The court had to navigate the cognitive dissonance of accepting Philippe's relationships while officially condemning sodomy as a crime, which they managed through the time-honored tradition of pretending not to notice what was happening right in front of them. It's the same skill they used for ignoring the smell, the lice, and the fact that everyone was constantly relieving themselves in the corners. Selective blindness as a survival mechanism. The elaborate courtship rituals at Versailles involved coded language, significant glances, dropped handkerchiefs, and other signals that allowed people to communicate romantic interest without being too obvious, because direct communication was considered vulgar and, more importantly, left evidence that could be used against you later. A woman might indicate interest by dropping her fan in a particular way, or a man might request a specific dance. And these signals had to be interpreted correctly, or you'd end up propositioning someone who definitely wasn't interested and creating a scandal. It's like if texting required learning an entirely separate language, except the stakes were your reputation, your family status, and possibly your financial survival. And all of this elaborate signaling was happening between people who, let's remember, hadn't bathed in months and were probably scratching lice bites while trying to look seductive. The human capacity for romance in adverse conditions is actually kind of impressive when you think about it. The kissing customs of the era add another delightful dimension to this already disturbing picture. Courtiers would kiss each other's hands constantly as greetings, and men would kiss women's hands as a sign of respect or romantic interest. Given that hands were rarely washed and were used for eating, wiping, scratching, and various other activities, every kiss was essentially a microbial exchange program. The king's hand was particularly sought after for kissing, with courtiers competing for the privilege of pressing their lips to Louis's unwashed fingers that had touched everything from state documents to his own clothes stool. It was considered the ultimate honor, which tells you how completely divorced from reality court etiquette had become. Some sources mention that the king's hand often tasted of the orange-scented oils he used to mask his smell, which is possibly the only mercy in this entire scenario. At least the flavor was citrus rather than the alternative. The perfume culture became so excessive that Louis XIV eventually had to issue regulations about how much scent people could wear, because the competing fragrances were giving everyone headaches and making people ill. The king declared certain days to be specific scent days. Monday might be rose, Tuesday jasmine, Wednesday orange blossom, to create some olfactory harmony in the chaos. Courtiers had to adjust their perfume choices to match the king's decree, which meant owning extensive perfume collections and having servants whose job was just perfume management. We've reached the point where the government is regulating what flowers you're allowed to smell like on specific days, and somehow this seemed like a reasonable solution rather than, say, encouraging people to wash their bodies. Its bureaucracy meets aromatherapy in the stupidest possible way, creating new problems while avoiding the obvious solution to the original problem. Louis XIV's reign saw the development of elaborate perfumed gloves, which became must-have accessories for the wealthy. Gloves soaked in expensive fragrances that would perfume your hands while theoretically protecting them from the elements. These gloves were works of art, embroidered with gold thread and jewels, and they cost a fortune, which made them perfect status symbols. The irony is that people were spending the equivalent of a servant's annual salary on fancy gloves to cover up hands that could have been solved by basic soap and water costing almost nothing. But that would be too simple, too common, too peasant-like. Better to develop an entire industry of perfumed leather goods than to just wash your hands like a reasonable person. The perfume glove industry in Grasse employed hundreds of people, all dedicated to solving a problem that shouldn't have existed in the first place. It's the 17th century equivalent of inventing elaborate air filters for your home instead of just not setting garbage fires in your living room. The obsession with covering up natural smells rather than eliminating them created a bizarre aesthetic where artificial scents became more valued than cleanliness. And the strength of your perfume was almost a competition. Who could afford the most expensive, most powerful fragrances that would announce their arrival before they even entered a room? It was chemical warfare disguised as sophistication, with everyone trying to outstink each other in the opposite direction, layering more and more fragrance until the cumulative effect was probably worse than if everyone had just gone on Adderall. The Sun King had created a court where the solution to smelling bad was smelling differently bad, just more expensively so. It's the kind of logic that explains why revolutions eventually happen. When a ruling class is spending fortunes on perfumed gloves while peasants are starving, at some point someone's going to notice the disconnect between priorities and reality. The clothing worn at Versailles deserves special attention because the elaborate fashions that we now see in museums as examples of refined taste were actually mobile petri dishes that trapped sweat, dirt, and bacteria in layers of fabric that were rarely, if ever, properly cleaned. Women's dresses could weigh up to 30 pounds when you included all the undergarments, corsets, panniers, and decorative elements, which meant you were essentially wearing a small child's worth of cloth that absorbed every drop of perspiration and body odor over weeks or months of use. The tight corsets that gave women the fashionable silhouette also restricted breathing, compressed internal organs, and made it nearly impossible to bend at the waist, which created all sorts of practical difficulties we'll get to shortly. Men's clothing was slightly less restrictive, but still involved multiple layers, tight breeches that cut off circulation, and coats so elaborately decorated that they couldn't be cleaned without destroying the embroidery and jewels attached to them. The undergarment situation was particularly grim because while wealthy people might change their outer clothes occasionally, the layers underneath were rarely washed and worn until they literally disintegrated. Women wore chemises, basically long linen shirts, directly against their skin, and these were supposed to absorb sweat and protect the outer clothes from body soil. In theory, you'd wash the chemise regularly and keep the expensive outer garments clean by proxy. But in practice, people wore the same chemise for weeks because doing laundry was labor-intensive, expensive, and supposedly dangerous to health since wet fabric against skin could let disease in. The chemise would become increasingly stiff with dried sweat, oils from skin, and various other bodily secretions until it could practically stand up on its own. Fashion historians examining surviving garments from this era have found significant staining and evidence of long-term wear without washing, which is museum speak for these clothes are horrifyingly disgusting when you analyze them closely. The stockings worn by both men and women were made of silk or wool and held up with ribbons called garters that would cut into your legs if tied too tightly, leaving marks and sometimes causing circulation problems. These stockings were expensive enough that people would wear them repeatedly despite holes, runs, and accumulated grime, and the fashion for white or light-colored stockings meant that every stain and mark was visible to anyone who looked. Some courtiers would paint their legs with white makeup underneath to hide the dirt and make their stockings appear cleaner, which meant they were literally painting their skin to create the illusion of clean clothes rather than just washing the clothes. The dedication to avoiding water and soap was truly remarkable. No amount of effort was too much as long as it didn't involve actually cleaning anything. It's the ultimate example of treating symptoms rather than causes, except the symptom was looking dirty and the cause was being dirty, which seems like it should have been obvious, but apparently wasn't. The wigs worn by men require their own discussion because they were architectural marvels of hygiene horror, constructed from human hair, horsehair, or goat hair, powdered with flour or starch to achieve the fashionable white or gray color, and rarely cleaned properly because the powder would cake into a paste when wet. These massive wigs could weigh several pounds and extended high above the head, requiring internal wire structures to maintain their shape. The heat generated by wearing what amounted to a hair hat in a palace with no air conditioning during French summers was intense, causing the wearer to sweat profusely, which would mix with the powder and create a paste-like substance that attracted dust, dead skin cells, and parasites. Lice and fleas loved wigs because they provided perfect hiding spots with plenty of food nearby. And removing a wig at the end of the day often released a cloud of powder mixed with dead insects, and who knows what else. Some men kept their wigs on special stands at night and would powder them fresh each morning, but others just wore them continuously, letting the accumulated filth build up indefinitely. The process of getting dressed each morning at Versailles for women could take 2 to 3 hours and require the assistance of at least one servant. Sometimes more if you were particularly high-ranking and had access to additional help. First came the chemise, then the stays or corset, which had to be laced so tightly that many women couldn't breathe deeply, then the panniers or side hoops that made dresses extend horizontally, then multiple petticoats, and finally the dress itself, which might be in several pieces that had to be arranged carefully. Each piece had specific purposes. The panniers, for example, made dresses extend up to 6 feet wide at the hips, which meant women had to turn sideways to get through doors and couldn't sit in normal chairs without special accommodation. Why were something that makes it physically impossible to navigate doorways or sit down comfortably? Because fashion, that's why. And because the wider your dress, the more expensive fabric you were displaying, which signaled wealth and status more effectively than any verbal declaration could. These massive dresses created practical problems beyond door navigation. Sitting in a carriage meant the panniers would collapse upward, essentially creating a fabric tent around the woman's head, and getting out of carriages without flashing everyone your undergarments required careful choreography and assistance. Going to the bathroom in these outfits was nearly impossible without help, which is why chamber pots were ubiquitous and why women would often just relieve themselves while standing, letting the multiple layers of petticoats absorb or redirect the flow. Yes, you read that correctly. Women would essentially pee inside their clothes while standing at social events, because removing 30 pounds of dress was simply not feasible for every bathroom break. The architecture of the clothing created its own sanitation crisis, with multiple layers of fabric becoming progressively more soiled over time, since washing the whole outfit was impossible and spot cleaning only did so much. The lower petticoats must have been absolutely revolting by the end of their wearable life, but they were hidden under layers of nicer fabric, so out of sight, out of mind. The shoes worn at court were another special kind of torture. Both men and women wore heeled shoes that were often too small, because dainty feet were fashionable, and these shoes had absolutely no arch support or ergonomic design. Women's shoes might have heels 3 to 4 inches high, making walking on the marble floors of Versailles treacherous, especially when combined with those massive dresses that hid your feet from view, so you couldn't even see where you were stepping. Men wore shoes with red heels if they were privileged enough to be part of the king's inner circle. Yes, red heels were originally a masculine status symbol at Versailles, not a feminine fashion choice. These shoes were often made of silk or fine leather, neither of which was waterproof. So walking outside in the gardens meant risking ruining shoes that cost more than a servant earned in a year. The wealthy would have servants carry them in sedan chairs or walk on temporary wooden paths laid down specifically to protect expensive footwear from mud and moisture. God forbid your shoes get dirty from actually walking on the ground like some kind of animal. The jewelry and accessories added yet more weight and discomfort to already elaborate outfits. Women would wear heavy necklaces, multiple rings, elaborate earrings, and decorative pieces pinned throughout their dresses and hair, all of which added pounds to their ensemble and created pressure points where metal dug into skin through fabric. Men wore jeweled buttons, ornate sword belts, medals, and decorations that served no functional purpose beyond displaying wealth and status. Some courtiers wore so much jewelry that they literally clinked when they walked, announcing their approach like a mobile treasure chest. The combined weight of clothing, jewelry, and accessories meant that simply existing at Versailles was a physical endurance test, and people would regularly faint from the combination of tight corsets restricting breathing, heavy clothing, and the heat generated by wearing multiple layers in rooms warmed by massive fireplaces. But hey, at least they looked impressive while losing consciousness, which was apparently the important thing. The makeup application each day was another time-consuming ritual that involved slathering on toxic substances in pursuit of the ideal aesthetic. Pale skin, rosy cheeks, red lips, and darkened eyebrows. Women and men both wore this makeup, though women's application was typically heavier and more elaborate. The white lead foundation would be applied thickly to cover any blemishes, age, spots, or signs of the skin damage that the makeup itself was causing in a vicious cycle of vanity and poisoning. Then rouge made from toxic cinnabar or carmine, crushed insects, for those keeping track of the ingredient list, will be applied in perfect circles on the cheeks, followed by lipstick and eyebrow darkening. Some women would paint blue veins on their temples and breasts to suggest aristocratic delicacy and pale transparency of skin, because apparently looking like you might die at any moment was peak attractiveness. The final effect was more mask than face, a painted facade that would crack and flake throughout the day, requiring constant maintenance and touch-ups to maintain the illusion of flawless beauty. The beauty patches or mooches were another bizarre fashion statement. Small pieces of black fabric cut into shapes like stars, hearts, or crescents that women, and some men, would glue to their faces, supposedly to cover smallpox scars, but actually becoming a fashion accessory and communication tool. The placement of patches carried meaning. One near the eye meant passion, near the mouth meant you were open to kisses, on the cheek meant you were married, and so on. So you could literally read someone's romantic availability and intentions from the decorative fake mole stuck to their face, which is either ingenious or insane, depending on your perspective. Some fashion enthusiasts would wear multiple patches at once, creating a constellation of black spots across their powdered white faces that made them look like they had some kind of spotted disease, which, given the actual disease prevalence at Versailles, was perhaps not the best aesthetic choice. But fashion has never been known for its practicality or common sense, and the court of Louis XIV took impractical fashion to previously unimagined heights or depths, depending on your viewpoint. The powder used on wigs and sometimes on clothes was literally just flour or starch, the same stuff you'd use for baking, which meant courtiers were walking around covered in potential food for bacteria and fungi while wondering why they had mysterious rashes and skin problems. When it rained, or when people sweated heavily, this powder would turn into a paste that was nearly impossible to remove without washing, which again, nobody wanted to do, so they just add more powder on top of the paste, creating geological layers of grime and starch that built up over time. Some wigs that have survived to the present day show evidence of this layering when examined closely. You can literally see the strata of powder, oil, dirt, and dead skin that accumulated over months or years of use. It's like tree rings, except instead of telling you the age of a tree, it tells you how long someone went without properly cleaning their hair situation. Museums preserve these artifacts as examples of historical fashion, carefully maintaining items that are simultaneously priceless cultural artifacts and absolutely disgusting biological hazards. The obsession with appearance over actual cleanliness reached its peak in the practice of using perfumed pomades and oils on wigs and hair. Thick pastes made from animal fats mixed with fragrance that would be worked into the wig to help it hold its shape and smell better. These pomades would go rancid in heat, creating a smell that the perfume could no longer fully mask. But by that point, you'd already invested so much time and money in the wig that you just kept using it anyway. The dedication to maintaining appearances regardless of the reality underneath is perhaps the defining characteristic of Versailles culture. Everything was about the surface, the performance, the image projected to others, while the literal and metaphorical rot underneath was simply ignored or covered up with another layer of expensive cosmetics. It's a metaphor for the entire French monarchy in the decades before the Revolution, but that's getting ahead of our story. For now, just appreciate the sheer commitment it took to look this fancy while smelling this terrible and feeling this uncomfortable, all in service of a social system that valued appearance above virtually everything else, including health, comfort, and basic human dignity. The dining etiquette at Versailles was a masterclass in elaborate rules designed to make eating as complicated and uncomfortable as possible, because apparently just putting food in your mouth was too simple and peasant-like for the aristocracy. Louis XIV would eat his meals in public during the Grand Couvert, where courtiers would gather to watch the king consume enough food to feed a small village while they stood there hungry, which was considered entertainment for some reason. The king would sit alone at a table while dozens or hundreds of people watched him eat, commenting on his appetite and dining technique like sport commentators analyzing an athlete's performance. Except the sport was chewing and swallowing. The courtiers who attended these meals couldn't eat themselves unless specifically invited, which rarely happened. So they'd watch the king gorge himself while their stomachs growled, then go back to their apartments to eat their own cold meals in private. It's the kind of social sadism that only makes sense in a system built entirely around one person's ego and comfort. The food itself was often cold by the time it reached the table because the kitchens were located so far from the dining rooms that the journey could take 20 minutes, during which time roasted meats congealed, sauces solidified, and hot dishes became room temperature at best. Louis didn't seem to mind, eating with legendary speed and enthusiasm, barely chewing before swallowing, which his doctors worried about, but couldn't really stop since telling the king to slow down while eating would be seen as criticism of royal behavior. The king would work his way through multiple courses: soups, fish, roasted birds, game, vegetables, salads, pastries, fresh fruit, and preserved fruit, consuming quantities that would make competitive eaters jealous, all while maintaining perfect posture and occasionally making conversation with selected courtiers who had the privilege of being spoken to while His Majesty masticated. One observer noted that Louis ate so quickly that others at the table, when he allowed others to dine with him, would have to race to keep up or be left behind as courses were cleared away. The utensils used at meals were surprisingly limited. Forks were still relatively new to French dining, and many people, including the king, preferred eating with their hands or using knives and spoons to transport food to their mouths. The fork was viewed with suspicion by some religious authorities who argued that God gave us fingers to eat with, and using metal prongs was somehow sacrilegious or effeminate, which is the kind of theological argument that makes you wonder what else church officials were spending their time debating. When forks were used, they typically had only two tines and were used more for holding food still, while cutting rather than the modern purpose of conveying food to mouth. So you'd have nobles in jeweled clothing and powdered wigs, trying to maintain dignity while gnawing meat off bones with their hands and wiping their greasy fingers on their napkins, or, when napkins weren't available, their clothing. The contrast between the elaborate table settings with crystal glasses, silver plates, and fine linens, and the actual barbaric eating methods would be comical if it weren't so gross. The napkin situation deserves mention because elaborate napkin folding was an art form at Versailles, with servants creating sculptural designs from starched linen that would be displayed on tables before meals. These napkin sculptures might be shaped like swans, ships, or architectural features, and they were so elaborate that destroying them by actually using the napkin felt wrong. So many diners would avoid using their napkins and just wipe their hands on their clothes instead. Yes, rather than mess up the decorative napkin swan. Nobles would soil their expensive silk outfits, which is the kind of priority confusion that defined court life. Some sources mention that the king himself would occasionally compliment particularly impressive napkin designs, which meant servants spent hours folding laundry into shapes to please a man who would then eat with his hands and probably not use the napkin anyway. The amount of human labor dedicated to completely useless tasks at Versailles could have built several more palaces or fed thousands of people. But instead it went into folded swans and watching the king eat. The wine consumption during meals was prodigious, with Louis XIV himself drinking wine diluted with water at every meal, sometimes consuming several bottles worth over the course of a lengthy dinner. Other courtiers drank even more, partly for the alcohol's effects, and partly because wine was safer than water given the contamination issues already discussed. Being drunk at court wasn't considered shameful unless you became sloppy or lost control in public, at which point you'd become gossip fodder and potentially lose favor with the king. There are numerous accounts of nobles vomiting discreetly into corners or behind curtains during or after elaborate meals, unable to make it to chamber pots or toilets due to the combination of alcohol, overeating, and tight clothing restricting their stomachs. The palace must have reeked of vomit in addition to all the other delightful aromas we've discussed, creating a sensory experience that would make modern party cleanup crews quit on the spot. But this was normal, accepted, just another aspect of court life that everyone pretended not to notice while it was literally happening in their peripheral vision. The exotic food served at royal banquets included things that would horrify modern diners. Whole roasted peacocks with their feathers reattached after cooking for decoration, swans, larks by the dozens, and elaborate meat pies that might contain a mixture of different animals that were impossible to identify by taste. The famous turducken has nothing on some of the abominations created by French royal chefs, who would stuff one animal inside another in nested configurations that required engineering degrees to construct and strong stomachs to consume. There were pies that, when cut open, would release live birds that would fly around the dining room while guests laughed and tried to catch them, because apparently dinner needed more chaos and bird droppings to be truly entertaining. The amount of animal death required to feed the court was staggering. Hundreds of birds, dozens of large game animals, countless fish, all slaughtered daily to satisfy the appetites of people who could barely taste their food because they destroyed their palates with rich sauces, excessive wine, and the general sensory overload of eating too much too quickly too often. The sugar consumption at court was equally excessive and contributed to the terrible dental health that plagued the aristocracy, including the king himself. Sugar was expensive and therefore a status symbol, so wealthy people would consume it conspicuously in elaborate desserts, sweetened wines, and even in savory dishes where it didn't belong. Louis XIV loved sweets and would have elaborate sugar sculptures created for special occasions. Entire buildings, scenes, and figures made from spun sugar that took artisans days to create and would be destroyed in minutes as guests ate pieces of the decorations. His teeth rotted accordingly, turning black and eventually being extracted one by one in procedures that were agonizing since anesthesia didn't exist beyond getting the patient drunk first and hoping they passed out from pain. By middle age, Louis had few teeth left, which didn't stop him from eating. He'd just swallow things mostly whole or have servants pre-cut his food into tiny pieces. Watching the Sun King gum his way through a meal must have been a special kind of unappetizing, but courtiers maintained their expressions of respectful attention because showing disgust at royal eating habits was career suicide. The formal toast during meals required everyone to stand, drink simultaneously, and observe strict protocol about who could toast whom and in what order, turning simple drinking into a choreographed performance where one wrong move could cause offense. The king might toast specific individuals, which was a great honor, or he might make general toasts to concepts like France, victory, or God, at which point everyone would drink whether they wanted to or not. Refusing to drink a royal toast was essentially refusing to participate in court life, marking you as an outsider or rebel, so people would drink even when they'd already had too much, leading to the aforementioned vomiting situations. The whole system was designed to enforce conformity and hierarchy through social pressure wrapped in elaborate manners. You weren't being forced to drink, you were choosing to participate in civilized court behavior. And if that choice made you sick, well, that was the price of sophistication. It's peer pressure elevated to an art form and enforced by the threat of social and economic ruin. The breakfast situation at Versailles was less formal than dinner, but no less strange. Louis XIV would have his petit lever, a small breakfast usually consisting of bread, broth, and watered wine, consumed in relative privacy with only a few dozen of his closest attendants watching. Yes, relative privacy at Versailles meant only having a few dozen people watching you eat breakfast in bed, because actual solitude was essentially impossible for the king. Other courtiers would have breakfast in their apartments, if they had apartments, or grab something from the palace kitchens if they didn't. The quality of what you could obtain from the kitchens depended entirely on your status and relationships with the kitchen staff, creating another layer of hierarchy and political maneuvering around something as basic as getting breakfast. Lower-ranking nobles might not eat until late morning or early afternoon because they couldn't access food easily and couldn't leave the palace to find it elsewhere without missing important court events. So you'd have people standing around hungry, watching the king eat, while maintaining expressions of contentment, because admitting you were hungry would be admitting you lacked the status to access food easily. The dining room chairs were another status marker. The king sat in an armchair. The highest-ranking guests might get chairs with arms. Lesser nobles got backless stools, and many had to stand throughout meals that could last several hours. Your seating, or lack thereof, announced your importance to everyone present more clearly than any title or introduction could. There were famous disputes over seating arrangements that escalated into feuds lasting years, with nobles refusing to attend dinners where they felt their seating didn't reflect their proper rank. Imagine being so obsessed with furniture hierarchy that you'd skip meals and damage important relationships over whether you got a chair with arms or a stool, but that's exactly what happened regularly at Versailles. The etiquette books of the period dedicated entire chapters to seating arrangements, explaining the subtle gradations of status communicated by different types of seats in different contexts. You needed a PhD in furniture politics just to navigate dinner parties without causing diplomatic incidents. The leftover food from royal meals was supposed to be distributed to servants and the poor as an act of royal charity. But in practice, it was often sold by servants to supplement their low wages, creating a black market in partially eaten royal food. Yes, people would pay money for the privilege of eating scraps from the king's table, both because the food was high quality and because there was a certain cachet to consuming something that had been the royal presence, even if the king's unwashed hands had touched it and his toothless mouth had gnawed it first. The whole system of royal leftovers created its own economy and hierarchy, with head servants controlling access to the best scraps and charging accordingly. It's the ultimate trickle-down economics, except instead of wealth, it's literally leftover food trickling down from the rich to the poor, and everyone pretending this is a generous and natural system rather than a dystopian nightmare of inequality and waste. But at least the scraps were getting used, which is more than can be said for the food that spoiled in the kitchens because too much had been prepared and couldn't be preserved or distributed before going bad in the pre-refrigeration era. The spices and seasonings used in court cooking were applied with such excess that many dishes were nearly inedible by modern standards, with amounts of salt, pepper, and exotic spices that would overpower any actual flavor of the meat or vegetables being prepared. This was partly to mask the taste of meat that wasn't quite fresh anymore in the days before reliable refrigeration, and partly because expensive spices were another status symbol. The more spices you could afford to dump on your food, the wealthier you appeared. The result was that nobles would eat food so heavily seasoned that it probably contributed to their various digestive problems, all while complementing the chef's skill and sophistication. The king's physicians would periodically warn him about his diet, suggesting he eat more moderately and consume less rich food. But their advice was generally ignored because Louis XIV didn't become the Sun King by listening to people who wanted him to eat vegetables and show restraint. He wanted to eat like a king, which meant excess in all things, and his body paid the price over his 77 years, even as his doctors kept insisting their treatments were working perfectly. The entertainment at Versailles was as elaborate and uncomfortable as everything else, with theatrical performances, concerts, ballets, and masquerade balls that could last for hours or even days, during which courtiers were expected to remain present, attentive, and enthusiastic regardless of physical discomfort, exhaustion, or desperate need for a bathroom. Louis XIV loved ballet and actually performed in numerous productions during his younger years, earning his Sun King nickname partly from a role where he played Apollo, the sun god, dressed in a costume covered in gold and radiating beams. The image of the absolute monarch dancing around in a sparkly sun costume while his courtiers applauded with appropriate enthusiasm is either charmingly theatrical or deeply weird, depending on your perspective. As he aged and could no longer dance himself, Louis became an avid spectator, commissioning elaborate productions that combined music, dance, and theatrical spectacle into multimedia experiences that would last entire evenings while the audience sat or stood in uncomfortable clothes, breathing recycled air perfumed with multiple competing scents and human funk. The theaters and performance spaces at Versailles were architectural marvels, but horrible for actually watching performances if you weren't sitting in the king's section. The best views and most comfortable seating were reserved for Louis and his immediate family. While everyone else crowded into spaces where sight lines were poor, acoustics were terrible, and the press of bodies in heavy clothing made the temperature unbearable. People would faint regularly during performances, which the other audience members would politely ignore while stepping over or around the unconscious noble, because stopping the show or making a fuss would be considered rude and disruptive. The performers themselves had to deal with stages lit by hundreds of candles that generated intense heat, wearing heavy costumes and makeup while dancing or singing for hours, all while maintaining perfect artistic expression despite being slowly roasted alive. The dedication to art in the face of massive physical discomfort is admirable in a masochistic sort of way that defined court culture. Beauty and sophistication required suffering, and the more you could suffer while maintaining composure, the more civilized you were considered. The masquerade balls were particularly absurd because everyone would wear elaborate masks and costumes supposedly to disguise their identity. But the whole point was actually to see and be seen, so people would wear masks that didn't really hide who they were while pretending not to recognize each other in a game of social theater that fooled absolutely nobody. The costumes for these events could cost more than a year's wages for a skilled craftsman, with nobles competing to have the most elaborate, expensive, and impressive outfit, which again made moving, breathing, and existing pretty difficult. Women would wear masks attached to sticks that they held in front of their faces, which meant one hand was permanently occupied, just maintaining the fiction of anonymity. The masks themselves were often made of velvet or silk and became soaked with sweat and makeup, creating soggy face coverings that smelled terrible and felt worse, but couldn't be removed without breaking the masquerade convention. So you'd have people dancing in costumes that weighed 30 pounds, wearing masks that impaired vision and breathing, in overheated rooms packed with other masked people, all while pretending to have a delightful time. The gambling that went on during and after these entertainments involved stakes that would bankrupt families, with nobles betting huge sums on card games, dice, and other games of chance in rooms set aside specifically for this purpose. Louis XIV disapproved of excessive gambling, but couldn't really stop it without appearing tyrannical. So he'd issue periodic reminders about moderation that everyone ignored while continuing to bet away their estates. Stories circulated of nobles losing everything in a single night of cards, having to sell their possessions, dismiss their servants, and leave court in disgrace because they couldn't maintain the appearance of wealth required for court life. But everyone kept gambling because what else were you going to do with your evenings at Versailles? Have meaningful conversations? Actually enjoy entertainment? No. Better to risk financial ruin on games of chance while surrounded by other desperate people also risking their futures, all in rooms thick with tobacco smoke, another recently introduced fashionable vice that was definitely not helping anyone's health or hygiene situation. The hunts organized by Louis XIV were legendary and mandatory for anyone who wanted to maintain favor with the king. Even though many courtiers had no interest in or skill at hunting and would have preferred to avoid spending entire days chasing animals through forests while riding horses in inappropriate clothing. The king loved hunting and would pursue deer, boar, and other game with obsessive enthusiasm, sometimes hunting multiple times per week regardless of weather conditions. Courtiers would have to keep up or risk the king's displeasure, which meant people who hadn't ridden horses since childhood would climb onto unfamiliar mounts and try not to fall off while galloping through woods after baying hounds, and a king who was actually quite skilled at this activity. The injuries from hunting accidents were frequent and sometimes fatal. Nobles would fall from horses, get kicked, shot by other hunters, or gored by cornered animals. But complaining or refusing to participate wasn't an option if you valued your position at court. It was essentially mandatory fun enforced by social pressure and political necessity. The elaborate picnics during hunting expeditions were another opportunity to display wealth and suffer for fashion, with servants transporting full dining setups in the middle of forests so the hunting party could stop for meals that included multiple courses, fine wines, and proper table settings. You'd have nobles eating off silver plates under trees, their hunting clothes covered in mud and worse, bugs swarming around the food, and everyone pretending this was delightful because the king enjoyed it. The logistics of moving kitchen equipment, furniture, food, and serving staff into temporary outdoor locations just so nobles could eat lunch in the woods instead of the palace is the kind of inefficient excess that would make modern event planners weep. But efficiency wasn't the point. Displaying the ability to command resources and bend nature to your will was the point. And if that required carrying a dining room into a forest, then so be it. The servants doing the actual carrying probably had opinions about this arrangement, but those opinions weren't particularly relevant to the nobles being served. The fireworks displays at Versailles were spectacular and dangerous, with elaborate pyrotechnic shows that would last for hours and occasionally set things on fire, including buildings, decorations, and sometimes people. Fireworks technology in the 17th century was primitive and unpredictable, meaning that rockets would sometimes misfire into crowds. Fountains would explode prematurely, and the people lighting these devices risked severe burns or death with every show. But the displays were visually stunning, transforming the gardens into spaces of fire and light that dazzled audiences who would applaud while standing at what they hoped was a safe distance. Louis XIV loved fireworks and commissioned shows for any significant occasion, creating a culture where spectacular but dangerous entertainment was valued more than the safety of the people creating or watching it. It's the same logic that built Versailles itself. Create something magnificent regardless of cost or risk, because magnificence is the point, not sustainability or sensibility. Multiple people died in fireworks accidents over Louis's reign, but the shows continued because stopping them would suggest that human life mattered more than royal entertainment. And that's not the message an absolute monarch wants to send. The winter season at Versailles brought new dimensions of discomfort because the palace was nearly impossible to heat adequately despite having fireplaces in most rooms. The massive windows that made the buildings so bright and beautiful during summer became thermal nightmares in winter, radiating cold that fireplaces couldn't overcome, creating rooms where you'd be roasting on the fireplace side and freezing on the windows side simultaneously. Courtiers would wear multiple layers of clothing, wrap themselves in furs, and still be uncomfortably cold during winter months while trying to maintain the grace and elegance required by court etiquette. The king himself would have several fireplaces going in his apartments and still complain about the cold, which is impressive given that he was the one person at Versailles who could actually do something about it. But apparently architecture that could be properly heated wasn't as important as architecture that looked impressive. The servants keeping all those fireplaces supplied with wood had one of the more exhausting jobs at the palace, constantly hauling logs through corridors to feed fires that barely made a dent in the overall temperature. The ice and snow in the gardens during winter created beautiful scenes that courtiers were still expected to walk through while dressed in thin-soled shoes and elaborate outfits that provided fashion but not warmth. Frostbite was a real concern, as were slips and falls on ice that could result in broken bones or worse. But the king's daily routines didn't change for weather, so neither could anyone else's without appearing weak or uncommitted to court life. There are accounts of people losing fingers or toes to frostbite after winter outdoor events, and of nobles falling on ice and suffering serious injuries that their doctors would then make worse with bleeding and purging treatments. The combination of cold weather and inadequate heating probably contributed to the spread of respiratory illnesses that would sweep through the palace population regularly, killing servants and nobles alike in an era when the common cold could become pneumonia, could become death without effective treatments available. But acknowledging that living in a drafty palace during winter might be unhealthy would require admitting that Versailles had design flaws, and absolute monarchs don't admit design flaws in their architectural embodiment of divine right to rule. The summer brought the opposite problem. The palace became insufferably hot, with hundreds of bodies in heavy clothing, minimal ventilation, and no air conditioning creating conditions that would violate modern occupancy regulations. The heat would intensify all the smells we've discussed, creating an olfactory experience that must have been overwhelming even by Versailles standards. Perfume use would increase proportionally, creating a feedback loop where heat made people smell worse. So they'd apply more perfume, which would then smell more intense in the heat, creating even worse combined smells. The gardens provided some relief, but walking outside in July wearing wigs, makeup, and multiple layers of clothes meant you'd be sweating profusely within minutes. Your carefully applied cosmetics would run, your wig would become soggy with sweat, and you'd return inside looking like you'd survived a shipwreck. But court activities continued regardless of temperature, because showing weakness or discomfort in front of the king was unacceptable. So everyone would stand around in overheated rooms, pretending to be perfectly comfortable, while their clothes became increasingly soaked with sweat. The noise level at Versailles during entertainments must have been incredible. Hundreds of people talking, musicians playing, dancers performing, servants moving about with various tasks, all echoing off marble floors and walls and rooms with terrible acoustics. The king would have to shout to be heard during crowded events, and courtiers would strain to hear what he was saying, because missing a royal comment or question directed at you would be embarrassing and potentially damaging to your reputation. The resulting raised voice conversations would create even more noise, a crescendo of yelling disguised as polite discourse, until everyone would leave these events hoarse and partially deaf, their ears ringing from hours of sustained high volume. Modern hearing protection wasn't available, so courtiers would simply suffer progressive hearing loss as they aged, unable to distinguish words in crowded rooms, but unable to admit this weakness without appearing old or infirm. The king himself developed hearing problems in his later years, possibly from decades of being surrounded by excessive noise, but he refused to acknowledge this and would pretend he'd heard things clearly even when he obviously hadn't, leading to some amusing and confusing conversations where Louis would respond to things people hadn't said. The entertainment schedule was so packed that courtiers had almost no free time. If you weren't attending some official event, you were preparing for the next one, meeting with allies to discuss court politics, or trying to catch up on sleep that the constant activities denied you. The wealthy at Versailles were essentially working around the clock at the job of being courtiers, performing nobility as a full-time occupation with overtime, but no days off. The idea that aristocrats lived lives of leisure is hilariously wrong when applied to Versailles. Yes, they didn't do manual labor, but they worked constantly at maintaining their position, networking, performing rituals, and attending mandatory events that were physically and emotionally exhausting. It's just that their work was wrapped in silk and called entertainment or etiquette rather than acknowledged as the grinding social labor it actually was. And unlike people with regular jobs, courtiers couldn't quit or take vacations without losing everything they'd invested in their court positions. So they were essentially trapped in a system of golden handcuffs where the prison was a palace and the bars were made of social obligation rather than iron. The medical care available at Versailles was simultaneously the best that money could buy in the 17th century and absolutely horrifying by any reasonable standard, representing the cutting edge of a medical science that was almost entirely wrong about everything. Louis XIV had a team of physicians, surgeons, and apothecaries at his constant disposal, which sounds impressive until you learn what these medical professionals actually did to their royal patient over 7 decades of increasingly desperate interventions. The king's medical records, meticulously maintained by his doctors who were very proud of their work, read like a catalog of torture techniques disguised as healthcare: bleeding, purging, blistering, cupping, and the aforementioned 2,000 enemas administered throughout his lifetime. The theory was that illness resulted from imbalances in the 4 humors, so doctors would attempt to rebalance these imaginary fluids by removing blood, inducing vomiting, causing diarrhea, or creating wounds that would drain supposedly toxic substances from the body. None of this worked, obviously, but the doctors were convinced they were saving the king's life with every painful procedure. The bleeding treatments involved cutting veins and draining significant quantities of blood, sometimes several times per week when the king was ill or even when he wasn't, but doctors thought preventive bleeding was wise. They'd use lancets to open veins in his arms, and when those veins became too scarred from repeated cutting, they'd move to other locations like feet or even the jugular vein in his neck. The amount of blood removed would be measured in bowls, and doctors would congratulate themselves when they drained a particularly large quantity, as if blood loss was an achievement rather than a problem. Modern medicine understands that bleeding weakens patients, reduces their ability to fight infection, and can itself cause death if taken too far. But 17th century physicians thought they were strengthening the king by literally draining his life force into decorative containers. Lewis survived decades of this treatment through sheer genetic luck and a constitution that must have been remarkably resilient, not because of medical intervention, but despite it. His doctors would later write treatises on their successful treatment of the king, completely missing the irony that their patient stayed alive by surviving their care rather than benefiting from it. The purging treatments were designed to evacuate the bowels through powerful laxatives that would cause violent diarrhea lasting hours, during which the king would essentially live on his closed stool, while his body expelled everything he'd eaten recently and quite a bit he'd eaten days before. The laxatives used included senna, rhubarb, and antimony compounds that were literally toxic, but considered therapeutic in the medical theory of the time. These treatments would leave Lewis weak, dehydrated, and malnourished, at which point his doctors would prescribe rich broths and strengthening foods to rebuild his constitution before the next round of purging. It's a medical merry-go-round of making the patient sick, then trying to make them strong enough to survive the next treatment that would make them sick again. The king's digestive system must have been in constant rebellion against the interventions inflicted upon it, but the physicians interpreted any problems as proof that more treatment was needed, never considering that their treatments might be causing the problems. It's the medical equivalent of the fireman who sets fires so he can be praised for putting them out, except the fireman believes he's actually preventing fires through his arson. The enemas. Oh, the enemas. Louis XIV received more enemas than anyone in recorded history who wasn't specifically seeking that experience for recreational purposes. His physicians believed that regular enemas were essential for health, clearing out toxins and maintaining the proper balance of humors in the digestive tract. The frequency of enemas increased as the king aged, sometimes reaching several per day during illness or just because doctors thought it was a good idea. The equipment used was a syringe with a nozzle that would be inserted into the royal rectum, often by an assistant called a clyster operator who had this as their actual job title at court. Imagine explaining to people at parties that you're the king's enema administrator. It's a position with access to ultimate power, but also to something nobody else wants access to. The solutions injected included water, wine, oils, and various herbal preparations that were supposed to have therapeutic effects, but mainly just caused cramping, urgency, and the need to evacuate immediately. Lewis would receive enemas before important meetings, during meals, basically any time physicians thought it might be helpful, which was constantly. The king's dental situation received medical attention that somehow made things worse. When his teeth began rotting, which was inevitable given his sugar consumption and complete absence of dental hygiene, the royal tooth puller would extract them without anesthesia, beyond perhaps some wine to dull the pain. The procedure involved grabbing the tooth with pliers and yanking until it came out, hopefully intact, but sometimes breaking and leaving fragments behind that would cause infections. One particularly disastrous procedure removed not just a tooth, but part of Lewis's jawbone and created that hole between his mouth and sinuses mentioned earlier, through which food and liquid would leak into his nasal passages. The surgeon responsible was likely terrified of execution, but apparently Lewis just accepted this as an unfortunate outcome and continued eating messily for the rest of his life. The dental infections that resulted from these extractions would have been agonizingly painful, but the treatment was more bloodletting and purging, because when all you have is a hammer or a lancet and a laxative, everything looks like a nail or an imbalance of humors requiring evacuation. The skin conditions that plagued Lewis in his later years, including what were probably fungal infections from all that unwashed skin trapped under layers of clothing, were treated with mercury ointments that were toxic and didn't cure anything, but did cause additional symptoms that doctors would then diagnose as new illnesses requiring more treatment. Mercury was considered a wonder drug that could cure everything from syphilis to skin rashes to general malaise, despite the fact that it was poisoning patients and causing tremors, cognitive problems, and organ damage. But since nobody understood germ theory or chemical toxicity, mercury remained a go-to treatment throughout Louis's reign and beyond. The king's skin would develop rashes and lesions. Doctors would apply mercury paste. The skin would get worse. Doctors would apply more mercury and probably do some bloodletting for good measure. And the cycle would continue until either the king's immune system fought off whatever was actually wrong, or he just lived with the condition while doctors declared victory anyway. Its medical gaslighting elevated to an art form practiced on the most powerful man in Europe, who couldn't fire his doctors without admitting that royal medicine might be fallible. The surgical procedures performed on Louis, beyond dental extractions, included the famous operation for an anal fistula in 1686 that was considered one of the great medical achievements of the age. The king had developed a painful anal abscess that wouldn't heal, so his surgeon designed a special curved scalpel specifically for this operation and practiced the procedure on prisoners and poor patients who didn't have the option to refuse being medical test subjects. When the surgeon finally operated on Louis, cutting open the fistula and draining it without anesthesia, while the king gripped the arms of his chair and reportedly didn't cry out, it was considered a triumph of both medical skill and royal courage. The fact that the wound was in the king's anus, requiring him to lie face down while the surgeon worked, and that the recovery involved weeks of painful dressing changes and the continuation of regular enemas because doctors couldn't resist, adds layers of indignity to what was already a horrifying experience. But Louis survived, the fistula healed, and the surgeon was celebrated throughout Europe, leading to a fashion where people suddenly claimed to have anal fistulas too, so they could have the same operation as the king, which is possibly the strangest case of medical trendiness in history. The pharmaceuticals available to treat Louis's various ailments included compounds made from mercury, antimony, opium, and various plant extracts whose effects range from mildly helpful to actively harmful. Opium derivatives would be prescribed for pain, which actually worked but also caused constipation, requiring more of those enemas to counteract the side effects of the pain medication. Antimony compounds were used as general cure-alls despite being toxic and causing their own set of symptoms. Herbal preparations might contain dozens of ingredients mixed together based on traditions and theories rather than any real understanding of pharmacology, creating mystery solutions that sometimes help through placebo effect or occasionally by accident when one of the random ingredients actually addressed the problem. The king's apothecaries would prepare these remedies in elaborate laboratories, following recipes that have been passed down for generations, adding mysticism and ritual to what was essentially sophisticated guesswork. Some preparations took weeks to compound properly, requiring specific phases of the moon or planetary alignments. Because when your medical theory includes astrology, why not make medicine as complicated as possible? The king's hypochondria, which developed understandably given the constant medical interventions and the fact that everyone around him was obsessed with his health as a matter of political and personal survival, meant that minor symptoms would be treated as major crises. A slight headache might result in bleeding, purging, and multiple consultations with different physicians who would debate the cause and appropriate treatment, while the king suffered through their disagreements. A minor digestive upset would trigger emergency enemas and dietary restrictions that would last for days or weeks. Every cough, sneeze, or complaint of fatigue would set off medical protocols that involved numerous people and procedures, turning the king's body into a constant subject of analysis and intervention. It's exhausting just reading about it, and Louis lived this reality daily for decades. The irony is that the less the doctors did, the better the king probably felt, but doing nothing wasn't an option when your job security and reputation depended on actively treating the monarch. So physicians would invent reasons to intervene even when intervention wasn't needed or wanted. The medical treatments inflicted on courtiers who became ill were similar, but less carefully documented. They'd be bled, purged, blistered, and dosed with toxic compounds by physicians who were following the same medical theories that guided royal treatment. The difference was that courtiers had less access to the best physicians and had to make do with whoever was available, which might be someone even less competent than the incompetent royal doctors. People would die from treatable conditions made worse by medical intervention, and their deaths would be attributed to God's will or the strength of the disease rather than to doctors who had hastened their demise through aggressive mistreatment. The rare physicians who suggested gentler approaches or questioned established practices were dismissed as radicals or heretics, because medical orthodoxy was as rigid as religious orthodoxy and challenging it could end your career. So the same failed treatments continued generation after generation, killing or harming patients while the medical establishment patted itself on the back for maintaining professional standards and following classical authorities who had been wrong 15 centuries earlier and remained wrong in the present. The diet recommendations from royal physicians were equally nonsensical, based on theories about hot and cold foods, wet and dry humors, and the need to balance these properties through careful food selection that bore no relationship to actual nutrition. The king would be told to eat more red meat when he was sluggish, more fish when he had too much heat in his humors, more wine to strengthen the blood, less wine to cool excessive passions, a constantly shifting set of dietary rules that contradicted each other depending on which physician you asked and what day it was. The result was that Louis ate whatever he wanted, which was enormous quantities of rich food, while his doctors pretended their advice was being followed and took credit for his continued survival. The disconnect between medical advice and actual practice was so obvious that courtiers would joke about it, but always privately, because publicly questioning royal physicians was tantamount to questioning the king's judgment in employing them. It's the emperor's new clothes, except the emperor is naked, sick, and being treated by doctors who insist their invisible medicine is working perfectly. The lifespan of people at Versailles was actually worse than that of contemporary peasants in some respects, because while the wealthy had access to more food and shelter, they also had access to more medical intervention, toxic cosmetics, rich foods that destroyed their health, and lifestyle factors like stress and lack of exercise that canceled out their material advantages. Child mortality was horrific across all classes, but wealthy women who gave birth attended by royal physicians had worse outcomes than poor women attended by midwives, because doctors would introduce infections with their unwashed hands and instruments, while midwives generally didn't interfere as much. The average life expectancy at Versailles, for those who survived childhood, was perhaps into the 50s if you were lucky, and that's with every material advantage except knowledge. They had wealth, power, and access to the best medicine money could buy, which was unfortunately actively harmful rather than helpful. Louis XIV's survival to 77 was exceptional and probably succeeded despite his medical care rather than because of it, a statistical outlier that his physicians would use as proof of their method's effectiveness, while ignoring the countless patients who died young under similar treatment regimens. The decline of Louis XIV in his final years brought all the accumulated horrors of his lifestyle into sharp focus as his body, subjected to 7 decades of abuse from bad medicine, terrible hygiene, rich food, and constant stress, began shutting down in ways that even his devoted physicians couldn't ignore or treat away. By his 70s, the Sun King had lost most of his teeth, suffered from chronic gout that made walking agonizing, dealt with digestive problems that kept him close to his beloved clothes stool more than ever, and experienced various infections and ailments that his doctors attacked with their usual enthusiasm and equally usual lack of success. His leg developed gangrene in August 1715, turning black and putrid as the infection spread despite frantic medical interventions that included more bleeding, purging, and the application of various poultices that did nothing to stop the tissue death. The smell must have been apocalyptic. Gangrene has a distinctive sweet rotten odor that even the most powerful perfumes couldn't mask, meaning the king's final weeks were spent literally decomposing while still alive, his body announcing its decay to everyone in his presence. The courtiers who attended Louis during his final illness maintained their dutiful presence despite the horror show unfolding before them, because abandoning the king even as he died would be seen as betrayal and could affect their positions under the next monarch. So they stood in rooms thick with the smell of rotting flesh, putrefaction, perfume, and incense burned in a futile attempt to purify the air, watching the most powerful man they'd ever known reduced to a suffering invalid whose leg was literally falling apart. The physicians tried everything. More aggressive bleeding that weakened him further, applications of hot irons to burn away dead tissue, which only caused more pain and damage, and various supposed miracle cures that were either useless or actively harmful. At one point, they even consulted a charlatan who claimed to have an elixir that could cure anything, and the desperate doctors gave it to Louis despite having no idea what it contained. Spoiler alert, it didn't work, and the king's condition continued deteriorating until even his physicians had to admit that death was imminent, and perhaps they should stop torturing him and let him die with some dignity, though that admission came far later than it should have. Louis faced death with the same theatrical sense that had characterized his entire reign, making prepared speeches to his courtiers, his family, and his 5-year-old great-grandson who would become Louis XV, offering advice about ruling France and avoiding the mistakes he'd made. Though notably he didn't mention maybe bathe occasionally or don't let doctors give you 2,000 enemas in his list of wisdom. He apologized for his wars and excesses, acknowledged his sins, and generally played the role of dying monarch with appropriate gravitas, giving everyone present the kind of performance they expected from the Sun King, even as his body betrayed him in the most undignified ways possible. The death watch lasted for days as Louis lingered in agony, his gangrenous leg spreading infection throughout his body, his consciousness fading in and out, while court functionaries began positioning themselves for the transition to the new reign. It's a stark reminder that no matter how much power you accumulate, how many palaces you build, or how elaborately you perform your life, death is the ultimate equalizer, and it doesn't care about your titles, your divine right, or your carefully maintained image. When Louis XIV finally died on September 1st, 1715, just 4 days before his 77th birthday, the immediate response at Versailles was complex. Genuine grief from some who had known him for decades, relief from others who had been waiting for the succession, and practical concern from everyone about what would happen next. The king's body was embalmed using techniques that were slightly better than medieval methods, but still pretty gross, involving removing organs, draining fluids, and filling the body cavity with preservatives and aromatics in an attempt to slow decay long enough for the elaborate funeral rituals. The heart was removed and placed in a separate container according to royal tradition, meaning Louis's body parts were literally distributed to different locations as relics of monarchy. The embalming process wasn't entirely successful, and reports suggest the body began decomposing faster than expected despite the preservatives, which is fitting given that Louis had been fighting a losing battle against bodily decay for decades. Death just made it official and unstoppable. The funeral ceremonies were suitably elaborate, with processions, religious services, and displays of mourning that were carefully choreographed according to protocols developed over centuries of royal deaths. But there were also reports of celebrating in Paris when news of the king's death spread, because while Louis was mourned at Versailles by courtiers whose livelihoods depended on royal favor, the common people remembered the wars, taxes, famines, and general hardships of his long reign more than his architectural achievements or cultural patronage. The Sun King had ruled for 72 years, longer than most of his subjects had been alive, and his death marked the end of an era in ways that were both literal and symbolic. The court culture he'd created at Versailles would continue under his successors, but would never again reach quite the same heights of elaborate absurdity, partly because the financial costs had become unsustainable and partly because the next generations of royals had witnessed the toll this lifestyle took and maybe, just maybe, wanted to avoid dying of gangrene after decades of enemas. The legacy Louis left behind included the Palace of Versailles itself, which stands today as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and one of the most visited tourist attractions in France, though the modern tourist experience carefully omits most of the information about the hygiene catastrophe that defined daily life there. Tour guides discuss the architecture, the art, the hall of mirrors, and the elaborate gardens, but rarely mention that those beautiful gardens were used as open-air toilets or that the hall of mirrors reflected images of people who hadn't bathed in months and were covered in lice. The sanitized version of Versailles history focuses on the glamour and sophistication, creating a romanticized vision of court life that bears little resemblance to the smelly, uncomfortable, disease-ridden reality experienced by the people who actually live there. It's historical revisionism through selective amnesia, choosing to remember the gold leaf and forget the body odor, celebrate the fashion, and ignore the filth underneath it. The French Revolution that would come 74 years after Louis XIV's death can be understood partly as a reaction to the system of waste, excess, and hierarchical absurdity that he perfected. When you build a society where nobles compete for the privilege of watching the king take a dump while peasants starve, eventually someone's going to notice the disconnect and suggest that perhaps this isn't the best way to organize civilization. Louis XIV's absolute monarchy, with its elaborate rituals, crushing taxes to fund construction projects and wars, and complete disregard for the welfare of common people in favor of maintaining aristocratic luxury, created conditions that would eventually lead to guillotines and revolution. But that was decades away when Louis died, and in the immediate aftermath, the system he'd built continued operating more or less as designed, just with a new king who was 5 years old and therefore couldn't personally oversee his own dressing ceremony for several years, which must have been a relief to everyone involved. The medical lessons that should have been learned from Louis XIV treatment, that bleeding and purging don't cure disease, that mercury is poisonous, that enemas are not a panacea for all ailments, that doctors should wash their hands, were mostly ignored for decades or even centuries after his death. Medical practice continued following the same failed theories, killing patients with treatments that were meant to cure them, until gradually, painfully slowly, the scientific method and germ theory revolutionized healthcare in the 19th century. Louis's physicians wrote extensively about their treatment of the king, and their writings were studied by subsequent generations of doctors who learned all the wrong lessons, perpetuating medical practices that were actively harmful because the alternative was admitting that centuries of medical tradition were based on fundamental misunderstandings of how human bodies work. It's easier to continue doing what's always been done than to acknowledge that maybe, just maybe, the accumulated wisdom of ages is actually accumulated ignorance dressed in fancy language. The hygiene practices that defined Versailles under Louis XIV, or rather, the lack of hygiene practices, also continued largely unchanged for decades after his death among the European aristocracy. The cultural association between nobility and avoidance of bathing persisted, with fashionable people continuing to use perfume rather than soap, powder rather than water, and elaborate cosmetics rather than actual cleanliness. It wasn't until the 19th century that bathing began to be reconsidered as potentially healthy rather than dangerous. And even then, the change happened gradually as scientific understanding of disease transmission improved and public health movements began advocating for sanitation and hygiene. The perfume industry that Louis's Stench helped create remains dominant in France today, though modern users at least have the option of combining fragrance with actual cleanliness rather than using it as a substitute. The disconnect between historical Versailles and modern France, where personal hygiene is generally excellent and public sanitation is highly developed, shows how much culture can change when you stop believing that water is trying to kill you. The architectural legacy of Versailles inspired countless imitations across Europe and beyond, with monarchs building their own elaborate palaces in hopes of replicating Louis's magnificence, though hopefully with better bathroom facilities. The palace became a template for royal display and power, influencing everything from urban planning to landscape design to interior decoration for centuries after its construction. What these imitators failed to replicate was the specific combination of factors that made Versailles both magnificent and miserable. The obsessive control of daily routines, the complete sacrifice of privacy and comfort for political theater, the transformation of bodily functions into public spectacles, and the willingness to endure extraordinary discomfort in service of maintaining appearances. Later palaces might look similar, but they generally included more toilets, better ventilation, and residents who occasionally bathed, suggesting that other monarchs learned from Louis's mistakes, even if they couldn't publicly acknowledge that the Sun King's model had some serious design flaws beyond the architectural. The final irony of Louis XIV's reign is that for all his efforts to create an eternal monument to his glory, to build a palace that would last forever and spread his fame across generations, what we remember most clearly now are the parts he never intended to be part of his legacy. The smell, the filth, the discomfort, the absurd rituals, and the elaborate facades covering dysfunction and decay. His intended message was, "Behold the power and magnificence of absolute monarchy." But the message history actually received was, "Look how ridiculous people can become when given unlimited resources and no accountability, and how suffering can be rebranded as sophistication if you have enough gold leaf and persuasive propaganda." The Sun King wanted to be remembered as glorious, and he is, but he's also remembered as the man who almost never bathed, received thousands of enemas, and built the most beautiful palace in Europe where everyone peed in the corners. That's probably not the legacy he was going for, but it's the one he earned through 7 decades of commitment to form over function, appearance over reality, and spectacle over sanity. The transition from Louis XIV's death to the reign of his great-grandson occurred smoothly despite the new king being a child, because the system Louis had built was designed to function regardless of who actually occupied the throne. The elaborate rituals and hierarchies would continue, the court would operate according to established protocols, and life at Versailles would go on much as it had before, just with a new face at the center of the performance. It's testament to how thoroughly Louis had institutionalized his vision of monarchy that it could continue operating on autopilot even after its creator died of gangrene, after a lifetime of questionable medical care and deliberate avoidance of basic hygiene. The machine he built would keep running for decades more, until eventually the revolution would dismantle it entirely and replace it with something that, whatever its flaws, at least didn't require nobles to watch anyone use the bathroom as a condition of political participation. Progress comes in unexpected forms, and sometimes it looks like the ability to pee in private without it being a status symbol or public ceremony. Looking at Louis XIV Versailles from our comfortable modern perspective, with our daily showers, indoor plumbing, deodorant, washing machines, and general expectation that people won't smell like decomposing garbage, the whole enterprise seems not just strange but actively insane. A collective delusion that lasted decades and involved thousands of intelligent people convincing themselves that elaborate performance was more important than basic human comfort or health. We live in an era where you can be considered unemployable if you show up to an interview with body odor, where dating prospects evaporate if someone discovers you don't shower regularly, where social media will destroy your reputation if video emerges of you doing anything remotely as unhygienic as what was standard practice at Versailles. The average modern person probably bathes more in a single week than Louis XIV did in his entire 77 years of life. And we consider this normal rather than excessive, which shows how completely our standards have shifted in the 3 centuries since the Sun King's death. The modern tourist visiting Versailles today will walk through rooms that have been thoroughly cleaned, renovated, and sanitized, seeing polished floors where courtiers once relieved themselves in corners, admiring windows that now open to let in fresh air rather than trapping the accumulated stench of thousands of unwashed bodies, and marveling at the beauty of spaces that were designed for display rather than livability. The palace smells now of cleaning products and the collective fragrance of thousands of contemporary tourists who, despite perhaps skipping a shower during their Paris vacation, still maintain hygiene standards that would make them the cleanest person at the original Versailles by several orders of magnitude. Tour groups crowd into the Hall of Mirrors for selfies, completely unaware that they're standing where nobles once stood scratching lice bites, breathing air that's been filtered and climate-controlled rather than thick with competing perfumes masking body odor, and generally experiencing a version of Versailles that's been so thoroughly improved that it bears little resemblance to the original beyond the architectural bones. It's like visiting a historical reenactment where everyone conveniently forgets to reenact the truly awful parts. The bathrooms available to modern Versailles visitors are clean, numerous, properly maintained facilities with running water, soap, toilet paper, and all the basic amenities that somehow didn't exist when the palace was actually functioning as a royal residence despite costing more to build and maintain than entire cities. The irony of tourists complaining about bathroom lines at Versailles, where there are dozens of facilities for the daily crowds, compared to the original, where 10,000 residents shared maybe a dozen actual toilets, should not be lost on anyone. We've reached a point in civilization where public restrooms at tourist sites are expected to be cleaner and more accessible than the private facilities of absolute monarchs were 3 centuries ago, which is perhaps the clearest measure of genuine progress humanity has made. The fact that modern building codes require more toilets for a restaurant seating 50 people than existed for the entire Palace of Versailles tells you everything about how backwards priorities were during the age of absolute monarchy, where aesthetics and symbolism trumped basic functional requirements. The fashion industry still draws inspiration from Versailles aesthetics, the elaborate gowns, the decorative excess, the attention to visual detail that characterize court dress. But modern designers combine these elements with fabrics that can actually be washed, clothes that allow normal movement and bodily functions, and the general understanding that people wearing these outfits will also be maintaining basic hygiene and therefore don't need to be hermetically sealed in layers of unwashable fabrics soaked in perfume. When celebrities wear Versailles-inspired gowns to award shows, they're wearing clean costumes that they'll remove after a few hours, not outfits they'll live in for weeks while accumulating sweat, spills, and other bodily contributions. The romanticization of historical fashion conveniently forgets that those beautiful garments were also mobile ecosystems for parasites, bacteria, and odors that would violate multiple modern public health regulations. We've kept the pretty parts of history and discarded the disgusting parts, which is probably wise, but also creates a sanitized version of the past that makes it hard to understand how people actually lived. The perfume industry that Louis XIV court culture helped establish is now a multi-billion-dollar global business. But modern perfume is used to enhance personal appeal rather than mask catastrophic hygiene failures. It's the dessert after a meal of showering, shampooing, deodorizing, and generally maintaining cleanliness, not the entire meal itself, as it was at Versailles. The idea of using perfume as your only hygiene intervention seems as absurd to modern people as medieval medical practices seem to modern doctors, though both were considered sophisticated and advanced in their time. Contemporary perfume advertisements show beautiful people in elegant settings, confident and attractive, which is drastically different from the reality of Versailles, where perfume was a defensive weapon in an olfactory arms race between people who all smelled terrible and were trying to smell slightly less terrible than their neighbors. The marketing has improved even if the basic product, scented liquid you put on your body, remains similar. The medical field has obviously transformed beyond recognition since Louis XIV physicians were enthusiastically poisoning him with mercury and draining his blood on a regular schedule. Though the transition was painfully slow and resisted by medical establishments that had built their professional identity around practices that were actively harmful. Modern doctors wash their hands, understand germ theory, have effective treatment for infections, can perform surgery with anesthesia and sterilization, and generally do more good than harm, which is a low bar, but one that Louis's physicians consistently failed to clear. When contemporary people complain about healthcare, they're usually concerned about cost, access, or wait times, not about whether their doctor is going to suggest bleeding them with leeches and giving them an enema filled with tobacco smoke. We've progressed from an era when medical intervention was more dangerous than the diseases it claimed to treat to one where we can cure infections with pills, replace organs with transplants, and keep people alive through conditions that would have been death sentences in the 17th century. Louis XIV might have lived to 90 rather than 77 if he'd had access to modern medicine, or at least if he'd been protected from the medical practices of his era. The political systems that Louis XIV embodied and perfected, absolute monarchy with divine right, where one person's whims could determine the fate of millions, have been largely dismantled and replaced with democracies, constitutional monarchies, and other systems where power is theoretically distributed rather than concentrated in one person who rules until they die of gangrene. The remaining European monarchies are ceremonial shadows of their former selves, with royals who actually bathe regularly, live in relative normalcy, and don't require hundreds of courtiers to watch them get dressed every morning. The British royal family, for all the tabloid attention and public interest they generate, don't have the kind of absolute power that Louis wielded, and their scandals tend to involve who they're dating or what they said in interviews rather than how many enemas they received or which corners of Buckingham Palace they peed in. Modern democratic leaders, whatever their flaws, generally don't require elaborate rituals around their bodily functions, which represents genuine civilizational progress, even if our current political systems have plenty of other problems to address. The social media age has created its own version of Versailles culture. Elaborate performance of daily life for public consumption, obsessive attention to appearance and image, constant competition for attention and status, and the transformation of private moments into public spectacle. But with the crucial difference that influencers and celebrities generally maintain basic hygiene between their posts. Instagram and TikTok show us carefully curated versions of people's lives that emphasize the attractive and interesting while hiding the mundane and unpleasant, much like court culture at Versailles emphasized spectacle while trying to hide the dysfunction. But at least modern influencers shower before filming their content. The parallel isn't perfect. You can quit social media without losing your livelihood or being exiled from society, whereas courtiers couldn't leave Versailles without royal permission and risked everything by doing so. But both systems create environments where public performance becomes exhausting full-time work and where the line between authentic self and performed image becomes increasingly blurred. We've traded one form of social performance for another, just with better plumbing and hygiene options. The environmental movement and sustainability concerns of modern times make the waste and excess of Versailles seem even more appalling. The resources consumed to build and maintain a palace that size, the fuel burned keeping hundreds of fireplaces going, the water diverted for decorative fountains while the building itself lacked basic sanitation, the endless consumption of luxury goods that were worn briefly and discarded, all represent a level of unsustainable resource use that would cause modern environmental activists to have collective strokes. Louis XIV reign produced enormous carbon emissions, though nobody was measuring that at the time, and ecological damage in service of creating beauty and displaying power, priorities that seem increasingly difficult to justify as we face climate change and resource depletion. The fact that Versailles still stands and functions as a museum generating tourist revenue for France might be the only environmental justification for its construction. At least it's been continuously useful for centuries rather than being abandoned and wasted. But the model of conspicuous consumption and disregard for environmental impact that it represents is exactly what modern civilization needs to move away from if we want to avoid our own form of systemic collapse. The class consciousness that would eventually lead to the French Revolution was already present, but suppressed during Louis XIV reign, with peasants and working people fully aware that their taxes were funding palace construction and aristocratic luxury, while they struggled to survive, but lacking the organizational capacity or ideological framework to effectively challenge the system. Modern democratic societies have theoretically addressed this through progressive taxation, social safety nets, and political systems where everyone's vote counts equally regardless of wealth or birth, though in practice wealth still confers enormous advantages and inequality remains a persistent problem. But at least we've moved past the idea that some people are inherently superior by birth and entitled to watch others use the bathroom as a privilege of their noble status. The social mobility available in modern Western societies, where someone born poor can theoretically become wealthy through education and effort, represents progress, even if the reality often falls short of the ideal. Nobody today is born into a position where their job is holding the king's shirt or operating his enema equipment, which is definitely an improvement over the Versailles system. The hygiene standards we now take for granted, daily showers, regular teeth brushing, deodorant, clean clothes, functioning toilets, soap, shampoo, and all the other products that fill modern bathrooms, represent a genuine improvement in human quality of life that's hard to overstate when you consider how people lived at supposedly the most sophisticated court in Europe. The fact that even homeless people in modern developed nations generally have better access to hygiene facilities than Louis XIV did, through public restrooms and shelter services, shows how much baseline standards have improved. We've democratized cleanliness in ways that make the elaborate, unwashed excess of Versailles seem not just distant, but nearly incomprehensible. Try explaining to someone who showers daily that the richest, most powerful people in 17th century France considered bathing dangerous and prefer to marinate in their own filth while wearing expensive perfume. and watched them struggle to understand how that system made sense to anyone. It didn't make sense. It was just what people did because medical authorities said so, and changing would require admitting those authorities were wrong, which nobody with power wanted to do. So what can we learn from the stench of the Sun King beyond a renewed appreciation for indoor plumbing and basic hygiene? Perhaps that systems built entirely around performance and appearance, where maintaining image is more important than addressing real problems, inevitably become dysfunctional and unsustainable regardless of how much gold leaf you apply to the facade. That concentrating power in individuals who are never told no and surrounded by people invested in maintaining delusions leads to absurd outcomes where the emperor literally doesn't wear clean clothes and everyone pretends that's fine. That medical and scientific knowledge should be based on evidence and willingness to admit error rather than adherence to tradition and authority regardless of outcomes. That basic human dignity and comfort matter more than elaborate ritual and hierarchy, even if, especially if, challenging that hierarchy means losing status and privilege. Louis XIV Versailles was magnificent and terrible, beautiful and disgusting, the pinnacle of human artistic achievement built on a foundation of human misery and dysfunction. And it lasted as long as it did because enough people benefited from the system or feared the consequences of challenging it that they'd rather endure lice, stench, and enemas than admit maybe there was a better way to organize society. The final question we should ask ourselves while smelling significantly better than anyone at the original Versailles: what aspects of our current civilization will future generations look back on with the same bewildered disgust we feel contemplating the Sun King's hygiene? What practices that seem normal or necessary now will be revealed as obviously harmful or absurd once we have enough distance to see them clearly? What elaborate performances are we maintaining that future people will wonder how we tolerated? And what basic improvements in human welfare are we resisting because admitting current systems are flawed would threaten existing power structures? History is ultimately a mirror we hold up to the present. And if the reflection of Louis XIV court shows us anything, it's that sophistication without wisdom, power without accountability, and performance without substance creates systems that look impressive but smell terrible and eventually collapse under the weight of their accumulated contradictions. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm going to take a shower and appreciate that I live in an era where that's not considered a dangerous medical procedure, but rather basic maintenance that prevents me from becoming a walking biohazard. Louis XIV couldn't say the same, and that's perhaps the truest measure of progress we can celebrate. We've moved from a world where kings died of gangrene after never bathing to one where everyone can be cleaner than royalty if they just turn on a faucet. The Sun King's dirty secret is that beneath all that magnificence was just a man who desperately needed a bath, surrounded by thousands of others in the same condition, all pretending together that this was somehow the height of civilization rather than its most perfumed low point.